everybody. Welcome to another episode of Slingers. Today, our special guest is David Lucarelli.
Hey Ben, how you doing?
Pretty good, sir. Thanks for agreeing to come on the show.
Sure, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about writing. What got you into writing?
I'm the son of an English teacher, and my father kind of he has a PhD in medieval literature and a minor in Shakespeare. So he really raised me with a love of books and theater and the written word. And my mother, before she became a police officer, she actually also taught school, and my stepmother was a teacher. So really, I was probably destined to have a love of the written word.
That's awesome. Was there a specific book that really pulled you in? That you said, I can do this.
My dad definitely read to me when I was a kid, and relatively sophisticated stuff. I mean, he read to me cover to cover The Hobbit, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lord of the Rings,
Wow.
all that stuff when I was pretty young. And I remember in second grade when they started giving out writing assignments, and kids were writing very short stories about, maybe a paragraph long, a couple sentences. I was already subdividing by chapter and, writing these long epics and stuff. So I think I just had a natural inclination. I love a good story, and I love telling a good story.
Nice. Do you remember the first story you ever wrote?
The first story I ever wrote, I think somewhere around second and third grade, I started writing some kind of fantasy epics that were probably heavily influenced by Tolkien and the Arthurian legends and that kind of thing.
Wow. Have you ever thought about revisiting that stuff now that you're older?
Yeah, I've gone back, and there's definitely the seeds of some interesting stuff there, but it's I've got a lot on my to-do list to do before I get there.
Gotcha. So it sounds like you were more into books, and so you probably wrote that way. What brought you into comics?
Yeah, so I'm also a musician, and I've played in bands for since high school, and then I got to a point where I met Sherry Solomon, the love of my life, and we had a child together and got married. And suddenly the idea of going on tour with the band and getting signed and all that didn't really seem that appealing, because I didn't want to miss out on watching my son grow up. But I've had a lifelong love of comics, and that I didn't want to go to my grave not having written some comics. So that seemed like the perfect time to do it, when I had a young boy at home. And that's kind of how I made that transition. At the same time, my day job has to do with recording ADR for TV and film, so I think that was an influence. 20 plus years of listening to actors and writers and directors try to fine tune and hone dialogue for television and film, I think has helped give me a pretty good ear for dialogue.
Yeah, definitely. I can see that in Tinseltown,
Oh, thank you.
which we'll talk about here in a little bit.
Sure.
So what's the comic book that got you into comics to begin with, as a reader?
As a reader, I probably the earliest comic books that I read were Marvel and DC stuff, but I think I immediately gravitated to the stylists like Jack Kirby and Frank Miller, Dave Stevens, in terms of artists. In terms of writers, right at the time I probably should have been aging out of comic books, came along guys like Frank Miller, Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Robert Kirkman, and all those guys were doing such incredibly exciting stuff, along with other stuff. First Comics and Pacific Comics in the 80s were publishing some really interesting books too. John Ostrander and Timothy Truman's Grimjack was always a favorite of mine. And yeah, so I just kind of never stopped reading comics, and I just kept my love alive of the medium.
Nice. Is there a certain comic book that really stands out to you, like that made a really good impression on you, made you want to do that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the cliches about Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's Watchmen. Those books really showed me that there are a lot of incredibly sophisticated possibilities. I was just watching the first couple episodes of Sandman, and it's great, but I can see why it took them 40 years to, figure out how to do it right, because,
Right.
Even some of the early Alan Moore Swamp Things are just amazing, and would be cutting edge if they came out today. What's another one? Howard Chaykin's American Flag. Like the first half dozen issues of that, when he was both writing it and illustrating it. I mean, he basically predicted reality television before it was even a thing, So I'm, just kind of in awe. It's sometimes how prophetic some of the books I grew up reading turned out to be.
Right. So is Tinseltown your first comic book that you've written?
No, so I started off doing a different book with the same artist, Henry Ponciano, who's the illustrator in Tinseltown, called The Children's Vampire Hunting Brigade. And it's coming of age gothic adventure, kind of like a punk rock Buffy set in Scotland. The reason why it's set in Scotland, it was inspired by the real life Gorbals vampire incident. So in Scotland in 1954, hundreds of school kids went looking for a vampire over several nights in this one cemetery. It was considered mass hysteria. They actually blamed it on comic books at the time. In our book, they find what they're looking for. They form the brigade, and then a half century later, there's a couple juvenile delinquents drinking in that graveyard the night the vampires come back. So... and so, yeah, we've done actually 3 graphic novels in that series.
Nice.
A couple of them put out by Creator's Edge Press, and then I put out the third one. But yeah, that was a really cool experience, because I got to go to Glasgow Comic-Con as a guest, and I got a tour of the cemetery where the incident took place, and got to use some of the experiences and people I met and things I saw in the later volumes. And they even did like an exhibit about the Southern Necropolis Cemetery that featured some blow-ups of some of the covers and some of the interiors from the comic. So that was pretty
really
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So Tinseltown, let's talk about that now. I know that was inspired by your mom.
Yeah. So my mother was a police officer for 20 plus years in Pittsburgh. And, she had kind of a rough go of it. And I started to think about what it must have been like for some of the early first police women, and so I kind of went down a little research rabbit hole, and I discovered that Universal Studios was kind of a semi-autonomously run city unto itself. And they were kind of a proto-feminist organization in that they had a female mayor, police chief, police officers around 1915, 1916, the silent film era. But they also were not above exploiting them by marching them in short skirts and parades and things like that. And I thought, that's kind of an interesting dichotomy. In real life, they functioned as kind of a cross between lot security guards and people that were there to assist and amuse the tourists. And then actually in doing research for the second volume of Tinseltown, I found out that they were not the only movie studio that had a lot of female police officers. D.W. Griffith's studio also did that. And I think part of the reason why it happened is you had a lot of extras. They were filming a lot of movies, hundreds of extras coming on and off the lot every day. And, it wasn't uncommon that some of these young budding starlets might duck down a hallway with some handsome lad they just met and get up to some hanky panky, and they needed kind of some female school marms to keep everything on the up and up and make sure that was kept to a minimum. So there were at least two film studios in that era that had female police officers. And then the LAPD actually had a few too. They were primarily hired because even back then there were underage, teenage female prostitutes and drug addicts and runaways and homeless kids, and the men were not really comfortable doing strip searches and things like that, so they needed to hire at least a token amount of female officers to help with that.
Right. Bet your mom had some interesting stories.
Oh yeah, she sure did. My mother, she had a meat cleaver thrown at her one time.
What?
Yeah, it missed, thank God.
Yeah.
She caught a murderer one time.
Wow.
And her commanding officer attended the awards ceremony and took full credit for it and forgot to even let her know about it. So,
wow.
That's Chinatown, Jake. But yeah, she was good. I think a lot of being an effective police officer is listening to people and not just barging in and throwing gasoline on the fire and letting people that are in uncomfortable situations say their piece and give their perspective, and whether they're guilty or not, treating them with respect and diffusing a situation. And she was very, very good at that.
That's awesome. Is there any story in particular that she told you that made its way into the comics?
No, but there is one that will make its way into the comic eventually that I haven't used yet.
Okay, we won't talk about that then.
We won't talk about that.
We won't give it away.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any fun stories she told you that you can share?
It's what can I tell you? Sometimes the stories that she would tell me were comical in that cops make mistakes, and sometimes it's like the Keystone Cops. You go to answer a call and you're down on the riverfront and you miscalculate and it's dark and suddenly you're in the river. So stuff like that can happen. But at the end of the day, one thing she did tell me is, there are good police officers. Most police officers try to do the best that they can. It's a difficult job to do under the best of circumstances, but there are also police officers that are just as bad, if not worse, than the criminals that they arrest. And, you have to be aware of that. Unfortunately, in some ways, the system is set up to protect them, and so, it runs the gamut.
Right. Gotcha. So, how do you go about scripting a story?
Well, it really depends. For the most recent Tinseltown that I did, Tinseltown Losing the Light, it's a 5-issue miniseries that just came out. The 5th issue just came out from, Alterna. That one, I literally broke it down scene by scene on index cards because the plot was relatively complicated, and I'm trying to figure out the pacing and the best way to break it down, the best order for all the scenes. So I found that was pretty invaluable to figuring out how to pull it off.
Nice. So is that typically how you do it, or is that just the first time you've done it that way?
It's not. I've done it before. I've done it before, definitely when I'm working on longer scripts. Generally speaking, if I'm doing a short story, then I know the beginning, middle, and end. But if I'm working on a longer 5-issue series, I know the beginning, I know where it's got to go ultimately, but there's definitely some leeway in between in terms of exactly how I'm going to get there. And I think that's where the index cards come in handy, and also just figuring out where the breakpoints are going to be, with where each issue uh, ends on at least a relative kind of cliffhanger.
Gotcha. So do you always make it a point to have like a page turner at the end of like every page,
Yeah, yeah.
or
I mean,
is that not
definitely.
as important?
Oh, it's something that I keep in mind. I mean, you want to always have something to motivate the reader, not just page to page, but also panel to panel. Be constantly
Right.
thinking about where their eye line is going to be and what um, because it is kind of an art, right? You're showing key scenes and then hoping in their imagination they're filling out in between what's happening between
Right.
those snapshots. And luckily, I work with Henry Ponciano, and he's been a great artist, been a great creative partner in bringing my work to life and making that, I think, as effective as it can be.
Yeah, he does a great job.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't just read well, but it just looks so beautiful.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I'm
Yeah.
sure he'll appreciate that, Henry, if you're watching. Yeah. Yeah, we've actually never met. We've been working together for
Really?
about 10 years,
Wow.
but just online. He lives in the Philippines.
Oh, okay.
He's got a brother in Long Beach. So I keep trying to get him out here so that we can meet in person. But, with COVID and everything, that kind of made things tough. But hopefully
Yeah.
one of these days it'll happen again.
Yeah. So, what makes a good story?
What makes a good story? I think you have to have something to say. Um, like, I think you have to take the reader on a journey that's interesting, and even if it's a fantasy or set in the past, something that rings true and says something about your experiences and how you relate to life, how you believe life to be, that hopefully your reader can pick up on their end and say, oh yeah, I that feels real to me. I can relate to that.
Hmm. What's more important to you? Is it plot or character?
You know, I think that ultimately uh, the characters are what drives everything. Otherwise, if it's just about the plot and you don't care about the characters, then you're just kind of moving chess pieces on a board. And it may be an interesting academic exercise, but it's hard to get your reader to care if they're not invested in the characters. But luckily, I think, if you um, imbue each character with their own personality and do your best to not make them simply one dimensional, I think that readers naturally start to relate to different aspects of the characters and they start to care, and then that helps keep them interested as the plot evolves.
Nice. Yeah, I've heard. If it matters to the character, it'll matter to the reader,
Yeah,
and I think
yeah,
that's very true. Yeah.
right. Well, plus, too, I mean, if it's a story that I'm interested in, then I have to think that the readers will be interested too. I was doing some research for Tinseltown Losing the Light, because I was starting to think about the background of World War One happening in
Mm.
1916 when the story set, and I was researching whether or not there was any German espionage and German spying happening in the United States at the time, even though hadn't officially joined the war yet. We were helping, the European allies and whatnot. And I found a really interesting book called Dark Invasion that details there were a lot of stuff happening. Was a lot of stuff happening on the East Coast in terms of German sabotage
Mm.
of supplies and ships that were being sent to Europe to help them fight Germany. And I also, they kind of covered it up at the time because they were trying not to join the war. But that formed the basis for a lot of the ideas in Tinseltown Losing the Light. I mean, the actual plot is completely made up, but it's not entirely dissimilar to some other types of stuff that we now know actually was going on at the time.
Yeah, there's some really interesting stuff to pick up from during that era.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Well, is there any mechanics of writing that you've learned over the years that you could share with us that you feel like have really made a difference in your writing?
Yeah. One of the bits of advice that was given to Neil Gaiman from Alan Moore when he was first learning to write comics is what they call the 210 rule. And that he got, I believe, from Mort Weisinger in the 50s, which is basically the way to achieve a good balance between art and the words in your comic is to never have more than 210 words per page and then subdivide those words by panel. So if you have, you know, a page that has 6 or 7 panels, I think it works out to be about 35 words per panel. And that's a good way to make sure that there's a healthy balance between the two. I mean, obviously you can always have less, but if you find that you are exceeding that, then, there's one of two things. You can, start cutting words and see if all that verbiage is really necessary. And you can also expand the scene and the sequence too. Maybe you're not, you're trying to tell part of the story in one page that really needs to be told in 2.
Cool. Something I've talked about with other writers is the whole show don't tell.
Uh-huh.
How do you do that in comic books?
Yeah, that's definitely something that that I'm conscious of, that I'm aware of. I mean, show don't tell. I think there are exceptions to that. I mean, obviously the words and the pictures are going to work together. They can be redundant, and I think that's, you see that in bad comics. Like if you have a panel of Batman and he's got a grimace on his face and his hand has just smashed a mirror, you probably don't need a caption saying, and Batman was very mad, right? It's sort of obvious. But then again, so you can use the words to reinforce or clarify or show what can't be shown in the art, what's going on in a character's head. Or you can also sometimes use them to contrast each other, because sometimes, fight scenes and whatnot can be kind of boring, I mean, and cliche and whatnot. But if you can come up with a way to at least make the captions interesting, and sometimes that's kind of a double meaning imbued in it. Like Alan Moore was a master at taking things and having the words work on multiple levels, both literally and as a metaphor. And I'm not sure what the word for that in the English language is in terms of writing, but I always think of there's the scene in Swamp Thing where Abby is, gets into a car, and there's a guy that's driving the car, unbeknownst to her, is a demon, and the car goes off, and so she went into the night by demons driven,
Yeah.
and it's the kind of thing that sends a chill up your spine. It is both literally reinforcing what you're seeing, but it's also working on another level.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. What advice would you give to a young writer who's wanting to get into comics?
Well, if you're just starting out, I would say take some of your favorite comics and reverse engineer them, break them down, turn them into a script. Like simply, if there's 4 panels on the page, write panel 1, and write the dialogue and the sound effects and do a description of what you're seeing in the panel. And because what that helps you do is realize why the writer made the kinds of choices that they did and why it's effective. And also, it gets you thinking, like, maybe there was a different way to tell that story or that sequence. Maybe there was a better way that the writer didn't think of. And I think it helps get your gears turning. And then after that, I think you kind of gotta just dip your feet in the water and write that first script and find an artist and probably pay them something to illustrate it, because that's the whole magical part of the process, is when you actually get the art back from your artist and you see their vision of what you had in mind. And frequently, because they're an artist and they're much more visually adept than you are, you'll be very pleasantly surprised at the kinds of things that they've added and how much their artistic contribution has improved what you were thinking of.
Right. Well, speaking of that, what's your favorite part of working in comics?
Yeah, I think it's probably getting the art back, from Henry, and then seeing how it's all going to come together. We've been working together for so long now. We're almost like mind readers for each other. So I can write a pretty bare bones script and know that he's gonna, if he doesn't understand what I'm trying to do, he'll ask me. But generally speaking, we're pretty much on the same page. Sometimes I feel like we're psychically linked.
That's awesome. So what's the hardest part of working in comics?
The hardest part, you're doing a lot of work on your own, and it's a long, lonely process putting it together. It takes time, and it's not like live theater where you have instant feedback in front of an audience and you can see what's working and what's not working, what one audience responds to. In comics, it could be 6 months later that the issue finally comes out that you've been working on, and then you hope that people like and appreciate what you're doing.
Right. That's true. It is a long process and long lead time from start to finish.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, speaking of plays, you just wrote one recently?
Yeah, so I've written a couple plays. I did one for the Hollywood Fringe Fest in 2018 called Dr. Zomba's Ghost Show. That was revival of a type of show they used to put on in the 1950s called Spook Show or Ghost Show. And, they used to four-wall theaters, and before there were horror TV hosts and haunted houses, they would put on spooky magic and show a couple of horror movies, and there'd be a seance and some burlesque and spooky magic tricks. And then at the end, they would do what they call a blackout sequence, where the theater goers would be in total darkness, and then they would be surrounded by supernatural phenomena that they could see, hear, and feel. They had all kinds of tricks to make that happen. We went back, we studied the Ghost Show manuals from the 1950s. We figured out exactly how they made that happen, and we added a few little twists of our own. So that was the first play that I wrote, and that did really well. We did 5 shows at the Fringe, and then a 3-show encore, and then we did 3 performances of it at a big Halloween convention in Long Beach called Midsummer Scream. So this new play that I'm doing is called Crude, Crude, and it is a completely unauthorized play about the baddest of the rock and roll bad boys that has not been authorized or endorsed by Motley Crue or any of its members. But it is darkly humorous drama. It's about a band that rose up from the streets of Hollywood to become a cultural phenomenon, and how for one brief shining moment, all things seemed possible. So, we just had 5 sold out shows in June as part of the Hollywood Fringe Festival.
Wow.
We're doing 3 encore performances
Nice.
this coming August 19th, 20th, and 21st in Hollywood at the Complex Hollywood. And some of the reviews we've got, they've said it's hilarious. brash, loud sexual energy floods the stage. The cast is brilliant, and they called Crude an important piece of American cultural history. So,
Wow.
yeah, I've been really, really excited and satisfied with how it's been going. There will eventually be a video on demand release for people that don't live in Los Angeles. But if you're in Los Angeles, we're going to put the link in the chat.
Yeah,
Please
the
come.
link is in the description. Yeah.
Yeah, please come check it out. It's a lot of fun. You do not have to be a Motley Crue fan to appreciate the show. But if you are a Motley Crue fan, you probably will very much appreciate the show.
Yeah. Congratulations on that, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
That's awesome.
Thank you. I
Selling
appreciate
out all 5 shows. That's something.
Yeah.
It's
I don't
amazing.
know. I don't know if we're gonna have similar luck with the 3 encore shows. I mean, one of the nice things about the Hollywood Fringe is they put on like hundreds of plays within the space of a month, and there's this huge publicity machine that goes along with that. So now for the encore shows, we're kind of on our own. It's up to
Gotcha.
us. But regardless of whether or not we're able to sell these shows out, it's still going to be a hell of a fun show.
Definitely. I bet that's satisfying to see it, like your words come to life up on stage.
Yeah, it really is. And I got to say, the star of the show is this. I shouldn't call him a kid. I mean, he's in his early 20s, but to me, relatively speaking, but this guy Ryan Ruffing, who stars as Nicky, and I work with some of the top actors in the industry. I have over the years, from Al Pacino to Tom Hanks to Tom Cruise, and guys of that ilk and caliber. And I really, really feel like Ryan has that special something where years from now, people are going to say, like, man, I saw him in a play in Hollywood in a 50-seat black box, and now he's gone on to other amazingly great things. And the rest of the cast is incredibly strong too, or else I wouldn't have cast them. But yeah, I think people have definitely been impressed by his performance. So for that alone, come see Crude.
Yeah, there you go. It's awesome. So what's next for you? What's your next project?
So I'm taking a little break after after the play, because it's a lot of work, writing, producing, directing, the show. And then eventually I will do Kickstarter and/or Indiegogo for a collection of Losing the Light. When we did the first Tinseltown, we did a director's edition graphic novel version that had a few additional pages of story. We will do the same thing for Tinseltown Losing the Light. It'll probably have about 3 extra pages of story. And after that, I'd like to do a horror anthology that's going to tie in with the revival of Dr. Zomba's ghost show. So
Okay.
it's going to be called Dr. Zomba's Ghostly Tales. And I'd like to do a 3-issue all-ages superhero book, because that is something I've never really done superheroes before, but I have some real precious memories of, when my son was much younger and growing up, and we were doing kind of role play stuff. And there were some story ideas that came out of that that I want to explore. And once I get that out of my system, then I will go back to doing some more Tinseltown. I know what the 3rd story is going to be, generally speaking, as a general concept. And, so I will get back to that eventually.
Awesome. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, definitely.
Looking forward to all that. All right, David. We're about out of time. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I don't think I don't think so. I just, there's a couple links in the chat. One is for my Etsy shop. So basically all my creative stuff is available at Abacab Studios on Etsy, and I'm happy to sign it for you for cover price. So, look up my stuff there. And I'm on social media. I'm on, Twitter at David Lucarelli, and I'm on Facebook, David Lucarelli. So, just find me. And I'm happy to chat or answer any questions you might have. And like I said, if you're in the LA area, all August 19th, 20th, and 21st. Come see Crude.
Yes. Yeah, and once again, the links are in the chat for both the Etsy store and the play.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right, thank you, David.
Take care.
Everybody, thanks for watching.